Hello. Welcome to this afternoon session. I'm Mike Martinez. I'm an assistant professor in the School of Journalism and Electronic Media. Dr. Maria Fontenot and I have worked to put this panel together on free press and the government. The theme of this year's Diversity and Inclusion Week is respect, and in this current climate of a severe amount of conflict, political divisiveness among our government representatives, and the uncertain landscape of public health policy, our panel, distinguished panel, is going to try to address the issues involving media, politics, and government. I'm going to start here with introductions and ask them a few questions to get them started, and then I'll open it up for questions from the audience. And I hope it ends up being a discussion rather than a lecture. We like discussing. So first off, Deborah Fisher is the Executive Director of the Tennessee Coalition for Open Government. Prior to moving into that position, Deborah spent 25 years in media as a journalist and a newsroom manager, culminating as a senior news editor at the Tennessee and in Nashville. She also is the director, I have to get this title correct. She is the director of the John Siegenthaler Chair of Excellence in First Amendment Studies at Middle Tennessee State University, where she coordinates programs for students in the community to expand understanding and appreciation of the rights embodied in our Constitution. So she's a constitutional expert as well. Next we have Jack McElroy. He is the editor of the News Sentinel. Jack's first newspaper job was as a reporter in a small Mexican border town of Douglas, Arizona. In 1977, he joined the Albuquerque Tribune in New Mexico as a reporter, working there 14 years, and ultimately as managing editor. In 1991, he moved to the Rocky Mountain News in Denver, worked there 10 years, and was managing editor when the Columbine High School shootings occurred. The newspaper was awarded a Pulitzer Prize for its photo coverage of that event. In November of 2001, he was appointed editor at the News Sentinel. And during his tenure there, the newspaper has twice won the National Associated Press Media Editor's First Amendment Award for work advancing freedom of information. He's a founding board member of the Tennessee Coalition for Open Government, and a past president of the Tennessee Press Association. So he's been heavily involved in open records and government here. Next we have Dr. Carol Myers. She is an associate professor at the UT School of Nursing and is a health policy expert. Carol and Brandon Hollingsworth host Health Connections on WUOT, a weekly segment intended to bring the often abstract world of healthcare coverage and policy to a human level. They give listeners a toolbox for understanding what you hear on the news or to separate fact from fiction in the healthcare debate. And we've had a lot of healthcare debate going on in recent times, and my head spins when I hear it. It's like, what's the latest version? Finally, we have Theodis Robinson Jr. Theodis first gained statewide attention in 1960 when the University of Tennessee refused to admit him due to his race, but after a series of meetings with various school officials, the Board of Trustees allowed him to register. In January of 1961, he became the first black undergraduate to attend the University of Tennessee. From this first, Mr. Robinson went on to become the first African American to serve on the Knoxville City Council in over 50 years. He was elected to that post in 1969 and served through the end of 1977. In August of 2000, the university appointed him to the new position of Vice President for Diversity and Equity. Mr. Robinson is also a regular contributor to the editorial pages of the Knoxville News Sentinel. And he just showed us the hat that he had made. And tell us about the other one. You had two of them made.
This one, for those who can't see, says "Make America Smart Again." And I have a second one that is black with large white font, says "Resist" with an exclamation mark. And so obviously I believe in freedom of speech and political speech.
So I want to start with Deborah. Can you address governmental threats to a free press and kind of give us a feel for the state of what's going on in Tennessee, maybe even particularly East Tennessee, and some of the things that we're facing or that we should be concerned about if we aren't?
Okay. Well, I mean, the First Amendment does protect the press. It enshrines the freedom of the press. But that doesn't mean, so essentially that means that the press is free to report and publish as long as they don't libel anybody. They're responsible for that. And they can't break the law in the course of their job. But that does not mean that government does not put up obstacles, doesn't intimidate, doesn't chill the free flow of information, and sometimes arrests journalists and stops that. And so I think some of the things that we're seeing really on a national level in some states and sometimes in our state too are efforts to reduce access to information by journalists, which sort of shuts down information getting to the public about what government is doing and what we kind of think of as your right to know what government is doing. And the press really serves, as a proxy for citizens and reporting and finding out information about government. So some examples of how the government can sort of shut down access to information. Probably the most obvious one and the most dramatic one is they can arrest a journalist who's covering an event and charge them with, whatever they want to charge them with. Failure to disperse. We've had journalists, not here in Tennessee, but charged with inciting a riot when they were covering a protest. So there are different things. In fact, there's if you're interested in that topic, and if you're a to-be journalist, you might want to check out a new website that is called U.S. Press Freedom Tracker, and it started this year. It's tracking the number of arrests and other things, violence against journalists in the United States. And there have been, according to this website, 23 arrests of journalists. And some of those charges were dropped, but 12 people are still facing charges. Things like failure to disperse. One student journalist was arrested for trespassing when he was interviewing people on a public college campus in New York. So anyway, so that's one way that we should be concerned about. We should pay attention to when reporting is stopped through that method. But also what I do a lot in Tennessee is monitor access to public records and access to open meetings. And another way that freedom to report on what government is doing is sort of restrained is by restraining access to that type of information, restraining access to certain public records, restraining access to meetings. We had a situation which was really amazing at a state museum board meeting a couple of months ago, or maybe a month ago, it seems like longer, where an agenda was yanked out of the hands of a reporter and she was told she couldn't see it. And they did pass a policy that prevented and chilled or made requirements for members of the board to even talk to the media, meaning they had to get sort of permission in advance, and if they said anything negative, they could be kicked off the commission. So there are ways that, and I'll just outline those in general, and we can talk more later if you want, but there are ways that government does restrict the media, and that's something that we need to pay attention to, because the effect of it is it dampens the free flow of information about government to the citizens of the United States.
Okay, thank you. Jack, the media has been accused of being the enemy of the people. We have to deal with alt facts. We have to deal with fake news. More and more, at least polls suggest this, anecdotally people will say this, we don't trust the media anymore. How do journalists, first of all, deal with that, and how do we gain our credibility back?
I don't know. Yeah, well, it is a dilemma. It's very pervasive. It's on all levels. It's sort of almost a standard ritual for public officials to diss the media. I mean, it's kind of part of our the way we carry on our public life. Butch Jones just a couple of days ago was asked a question in a press conference. I mean, I like to think of Butch Jones as the highest paid public employee in the state of Tennessee. I mean, okay, so, which he is, right? Okay. And so he's addressing the press, and he asks a question, or a question is asked about how a player got an injury. This question was really addressing rumors that were circulating in off-channel ways of spreading information. And you might think that, well, that's what we ought to do, is ask questions, get answers, sort out the facts from rumors and such. And his response was a very long lecture about the negativity that the media exhibited toward the University of Tennessee football program. And of course, he was feeling a lot of frustration, and he's under a lot of pressure. And but that is not uncommon. The kill the messenger goes all the way back to what the Kings of Babylon or something like that, and so it kind of comes with the territory. I think the way to respond is to sort of stick to the basics and respond to fake news with facts, and that's part of why the work that Deborah does is so important. And the issue that she was speaking to is documentation is a really good way to respond to questions of fake news, respond to accusations against the media, is to actually have it. Okay, well, but wait a minute, we have it right here. The information is solid. Issues of attribution, if you don't necessarily have something in a document, attribution is hugely important. And you'd like to, as much as possible, have information on the record, have named sources. If not, multiple sources with some explanation as to why they're seeking anonymity. And I think we're seeing this more and more in the national press, the Washington Post, New York Times, that we're not seeing references when stories are breaking to sources said. It's 6 independent sources confirm this information and asked to be remain anonymous because of blah, 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 blah. And so I think being real careful about attribution is a key to maintaining credibility, and just sort of keeping cool, keep doing the job. News is a process. I think Carl Bernstein one time said, we don't publish the truth, we publish the best obtainable version of the truth. And that changes as time goes on, more information comes out. So we're having, I think, amazing debates in America right now about facts and fake news and what's true. And this revelation in the past couple of weeks about how Facebook was used by Russian shadowy forces to manipulate our election is just the latest. And so we're in the midst of a fantastic national debate about this whole issue that over time, I think answers will emerge for us.
Great, thank you. Carol, the healthcare debate gives me a headache because it seems like every week or a couple of weeks, there's a new proposal of some sort, a resurrected pre-existing proposal. There's deadlines, they're trying to push things through and the debate gets divisive. How do we make sense of this? And kind of the other part of it, why does it matter to us?
Well, I want to answer the first part of your question.
Okay.
And a disclaimer, I am not a communications person. I'm a nurse with public health expertise and policy expertise. I recently have began to look at how media could help me advance my policy agenda. So I come at it from a very different perspective. I do have some association with, as a senior fellow at George Washington University for health policy and media, and notice that I lead with health policy. But I wanted to comment on some of the things that Deborah and Jack have said. The press is the proxy for citizens, and we talk about a free flow of information. Well, where I focus my efforts is on social media, primarily Twitter, and then using other forms of media like the radio. And I think it does help us, rather than being a proxy for the citizens, it is the citizens. It is really taking information and allowing that barrier to be removed, even when that barrier or translator, which is what I'd like to think about it more, is a very honest broker. I don't have the ill opinion of most of the press, some of it, some of the news media on television, but we're able to move that, and I think actually that could be for good or for bad. I think we've seen politicians, I could name one that wears a red hat sometimes, that was masterful in spinning his information by taking it directly to the people through Twitter. But I'd like to talk about how that could be used for good purpose. And I think that is in the healthcare debates. We had irregular processes in Congress where we no longer had bipartisan debate. So that debate occurred on Twitter. We have credible policy experts, Andy Slavitt being an exemplar, that was able to take the message about what does this mean directly to the people. We had folks like Julie Robner who just really dialed up her number of tweets to get facts out. I think the other thing that social media does, besides removing that barrier and providing direct access to information, it allows us to use information in a different way. And the one thing we know about health policy, and this comes a little bit to your second question, Michael, is that it is so highly personal. It embodies our values, it affects us directly, affects our livelihood, our ability to work, live, learn, all of those things. And yet it's talked about in such abstract terms. So Twitter gave us a vehicle, believe it or not, even with the limited characters, and I for one don't want more characters. But I tweet avidly and I read it avidly, and I don't want to read more, I want to read less. I'd rather read more from more different people than more from the same people. But what it allows us to do is to get information out, stories. Stories in the work that I do around policy advocacy are so critically important. And there's neuroscience to back this up. When I tell a story, different parts of your brain fire up than when I put a PowerPoint slide on or share a bunch of data with you. You can't relate to it. But you and legislators and other influential stakeholders can relate to stories. And I've been tracking and saving some tweets that in those short number of characters make abstract ideas come to life through stories. So rather than talking about all the challenges, which I think are many, and that's why we're looking for alternative sources, I'm saying that there's a lot of bad, but there's a lot of good, that social media can fill some of the spaces and respond to some of the challenges when used in a responsible way. So for advocacy, I know a lot of researchers now are using social media because it allows us to do that very important step, which is translate the work we do. If we sit here at UT and do research, that has benefit to society, but society doesn't know about it. So Twitter's also good in that regard. Thank you.
Yotis, you recently wrote a column about African-American representation, I think it was on the city council, or the lack thereof. Why, I know why, I want you to put it in words, why is it important to have diverse representation in our governmental bodies?
Well, we are a society, and people in legislative slots, whether that's the Knoxville City Council, Knox County Commission, or the United States Congress, they make policy that governs all of us. We need different perspectives in that mix of lawmaking to make certain that varied constituencies are having their concerns addressed, and that those policies that will impact them are better tailored to impact them in a positive way. Knoxville City Council had gone, I think it was 1912, when the last African American served on that body, until I got elected and took office in 1970. So you're looking at over half a century when there was no representation. Yet City Council was imposing taxes, allocating budgets, making various kinds of rules and regulations that impacted everybody. Now, this year, we're faced with the possibility, because of shifting demographics in Knoxville. The City Council in 1968 put on the ballot a change in the city charter that governed how city council districts, and at that time school board districts, were set up. They did this for two things. No African American had been elected to either the Board of Education or the City Council in over half a century because of racial attitudes here in Knoxville. And so they were looking at that and recognizing the need to have diverse voices in those policy-making positions. And secondly, court cases had been filed and were being won on the premise of one man, one vote, to that pointing out the fact that African Americans could not be elected or were not being elected. So they made this change. I ran and I won. And that's been followed by a succession of, over the last 47 years, of African American representation on the City Council. But this time around, in the primary, there were, because the seat is open, Knoxville has term limits, which I wholly disagree with. We have term limits, they're called elections. If you don't like somebody in office, vote them out. But you dismiss a lot of experience and institutional memory when you just carte blanche do this. We will soon have a city council where most of the folk on there, all of them after the 2019 elections, have no experience in this. But at any rate, we're faced with a situation where after the primary, there's an African American candidate and there is a European American candidate on the ballot. Given the voting patterns in Knoxville, there is a real possibility that Knoxville will be without any black representation on City Council, and that should be a concern for all of us. But let me also add, and this is a departure from your question, unlike Jack, who I write opinion, it needs to be undergirded with facts, but it is opinion and my take on things, and I just love being able to do that. I tend to think of myself as being politically incorrect. That's what this hat is all about. And I find ways to really, I try to put things in a context that perhaps people have not thought about before. It's a different perspective. And so I love what I do. I hate getting up to write on the morning, but when it's over, I'm so happy.
Currently, I think it's in Texas, there's a case before the Supreme Court about gerrymandering and making sure that there's representation, well, trying to make sure that the representation is fair. It seems like every cycle or two, there's always gerrymandering debates and arguments coming up. And to make sure that you all understand what gerrymandering is that they redraw lines in order to, voting lines, voting districts, to make sure that there is proper, equal, balanced representation. The problem is, the party in power is the ones that draw the lines, typically. So, by its nature, you've got a bias. So how do we deal with that?
Well, I believe the state of California has taken steps to move the redrawing of district lines away from the legislative body and put it with a commission that's a bipartisan commission in redrawing these lines. That's one way.
Mhm.
Courts have also stepped in when it's so, well, like and this is not so much gerrymandering, but it is on voting rights, that where the court ruled that they disenfranchised African American voters with surgical precision as far as writing the legislation. The courts play a huge role in trying to make certain that the system is balanced and fair. What we now have, though, in this country is a tilt to the reactionary right as far as the Supreme Court and lower courts are concerned. And so I don't think that we can always look to the courts as that relief mechanism for bias in our electoral process.
Carol, can you give us an indication about the current state of health care and insurance in East Tennessee? I mean, I understand that, for example, many counties in East Tennessee have one insurer, and which really is not a choice. It's either buy that or have none.
Yeah, there's a lot of rhetoric about this, and the rhetoric from a particular situation is then applied to the general, which is a problem. But for our folks that are on the exchange, which is about 16% of Tennesseans, there is a real issue about what the cost of the premiums will be this year, as well as what health plans are available. Since the Affordable Care Act exchanges came into place, we have had a significant decrease in the number of plans. And as you've said, 78 of our 95 counties, including many in East Tennessee, only have one insurance carrier. Here's the thing that's really sad, is I think it was September 6th, Senator Lamar Alexander convened bipartisan hearings. They were on 4 different days of the Health Committee, the Health, Education, Labor, and Pension Committee. And it was a real effort. I've watched all of the hearings to try to find some short-term solutions to help with the enrollment for 2018. And that got blown up when the Graham-Cassidy bill was introduced. And we heard a watered-down statement from Senator Alexander that they weren't making progress, whereas the day before, they felt they were 80% of the way with some consensus, bipartisan, short-term solutions. So yesterday, Graham-Cassidy blew up, it's done. And now there's the resurrection, but I heard a resigned Senator Alexander this morning say, yes, we're making progress, but it won't help for 2018. So this is a pattern of trying to do everything short of repealing, because they're unable to do that, to sabotage, and it's a group of people that are very needy.
Doctor, I was going to ask you, do you have any thoughts about people in the gap and Insure Tennessee, Governor has explained?
Well, that's another very interesting, okay, if I answer that?
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Okay. So Tennessee has elected not to expand Medicaid, and I think the backstory is incredibly interesting, and hopefully this will help you think about what you might be able to do. We had a governor that was elected with over 70% of the popular vote, and he worked hard to put together a plan that would be a Tennessee-specific Medicaid expansion, and it got very, very little traction. in the state of Tennessee, and his resistance was primarily from his own party. And the line was, well, we don't know if, and I don't like this word, I usually say Affordable Care Act, we don't know if Obamacare is going to survive the presidential election, survive the repeal and replace, survive the Supreme Court, survive Scott Brown, whatever it is, it keeps surviving, but we're not going to expand Medicaid because we think it's going away, or it's too expensive. Well, it's too expensive not to have it. So some have thought that perhaps there's an opening now that, at least for whatever period of time, the Affordable Care Act remains the law of the land. And it's, just to me, makes no sense not to look at expansion, because we're paying for that. We're paying
Yeah,
for
the money's
Kentuckians.
already there.
Yeah, Kentuckians have Medicaid expansion partly with our money.
Oh, yeah, and it's successful as anything.
Right, so I think you should be talking to your state legislators about when is this going to come back up. Unfortunately, one of our major champions will be leaving the state legislature, the Senate sponsor, Senator Doug Overby from Maryville, who's my state senator, has been appointed to a federal position and will be leaving, and he took the heat, and he kept saying, how can this be? My governor wants this. And yet it got nowhere, and the naysayers were other Republicans.
Too often in our political processes, decisions are made based on ideology and politics rather than common sense and what's good for the people. And that's what you see at work so much today across our country, like on the healthcare issue. I had started out this week planning on writing on healthcare. My question was going to be, how many times do you have to drive a stake through the heart of repeal in order for it to die? But then the flag flap occurred, so that's what Sundays would be about. But I do wonder, how many times do we have to kill this doggone thing in order to make it go away?
May I say one thing, though? Don't get complacent.
Oh,
Because the failure, more, if you listen to the rhetoric, was about process and the fact that we're not in regular order. That doesn't mean that philosophically, ideological, that some of those who voted against, I'm going to use John McCain, he never talked about the provisions of the repeal and replace. He talked about the process. So the threat is not over. The threat is over under budget reconciliation, because that goes away at midnight on the 30th. But we do not have a consensus in this country. Now, take it to the people, because the opinion of the Affordable Care Act is very low. However, when I ask you, Jack, do you like the fact that you're protected from pre-existing conditions? Or Deborah, do you like the fact that you can keep your kids on your insurance to your 20s? People love the provisions. The polls have been very stable, but they hate the idea because it's been so politicized.
for political advantage.
Please, go ahead.
So, in regards to the Affordable Care Act, where do you, in your opinion, feel like the middle class falls? Because I know personally, like my family and like numerous other families in my communities, that their insurance literally tripled. And like my dad had to drop all his employees off his insurance from the Affordable Care Act.
Well, what I'd like to do, if you don't mind with your question, is to talk about a very important point. You know, I carved out and said this is the individual market, it's 16% of people. But even though it's a very imperfect system that does not operate like a system, it's still a system. So if we have a problem in the individual market, it spills over to other types of the other parts, the employer, Medicaid, etc. So this idea that, well, it doesn't affect me, or that's not my slice, that really defies the idea of why we would look to have, you know, health care coverage for all citizens, the state, the country, is that we've got to stop, I think it was John Gardner, the war of the parts against the whole. Is that John Gardner? Someone's around my age. But anyways, is that we need to take a more, and that's what's hard for people to do. It's very easy to get you against you because this is good for you and bad for you. Sorry for pointing. But that kind of, what's the common good, a societal perspective, is one of those ideological things that right now doesn't have a lot of traction, or as much traction as I would like.
Jackie, one of the things that you mentioned earlier was when, with alt facts or fake news or that type of thing, is that the way to combat it is to push back with facts and with attribution and verification. One of the things that drives me nuts on Sunday morning talk shows and talk radio is when a public official gets on and starts blatantly lying, is the only way I can say it. I mean, they start spilling out a bunch of facts, and unless you're prepared, yeah, I realize this is real time, but unless you're prepared with counterpoint, it's out there. Can you talk a little bit about, okay, so there's a time lag between what one person says and the fact checking, if you will, or the kind of pushback or the set the record straight kind of thing that media, journalists need to do in order to accomplish this?
Well, I think I agree that the freedom that social media has given for free flow of information in our society has many attributes that we can be glad of, and that lowering the barriers and eliminating the gatekeepers in many instances has been very positive, and there's just a lot more information flowing. But we are in sort of a information anarchy now to a large extent as well. And it's very different than it was a few decades ago when the gatekeepers were a fairly small group of individuals. Walter Cronkite with the CBS News was the kind of the archetype of that, okay, you knew the truth because Walter Cronkite told the nation that every night. And so it's much harder now to achieve any kind of consensus on what what are the facts, and you would think, well, the facts are the facts, and of course we heard Kellyanne Conway's coining the term alternative facts, but it's a very real situation that we're dealing with now, and we all have, look, none of us can have all the knowledge that's necessary to survive in our society today. There's a very complex, interlocked world that we live in where, somebody, how does the light work in here, and does anybody actually know, and if it can we rely on these narrow areas of expertise and these and the sharing of information. And so while I do believe that the free flow of dialogue through social media and everything does have significant power and a lot of positives to it, I do think there's going to have to be some resurgence of fact-checking ground to stand on, of kind of trusted brands that are, okay, well, if you want to actually go to the truth, this is where you go to the truth. Now, the problem is those brands might, different groups in our society may decide that different brands have the truth, and that they will sort it in a different way. I think we're seeing quite a bit of that now. But goes to my answer to your original question of I don't know. We're in a very complicated time right now, and finding ways to sort out all this out. The other thing I will say regarding facts and access to government information and such, and government and the people who control the message are so much more sophisticated than they ever were in the past. And references Facebook manipulation as just the latest little thing. But it's at all levels. The ability to manipulate the truth is more expert than possible. I don't know how many people in here are PR majors. Okay, good for you. There's a lot of future in that, and good. And I think it's actually, and I'm not, there's important ethics connected to public relations, but the ability to manipulate the message is more sophisticated than ever. But by the same token, the ability to break apart the secrecy and and shatter through to get facts is also more powerful than it ever was, as we've seen with WikiLeaks and other ways where you have tremendous sudden shattering of major secrets, and so the dynamic's very complicated. Yes, sir.
So talking about like opinions that come like through media, do you think there's really such a thing as like an unbiased opinion, like a fact, especially with like all the influences on the media that we receive?
Well, I mean, you sort of get to extremely basic philosophical questions about perception of reality, and if you want to get to that level, then I guess, okay, I think, therefore I am, so what more can I say? Nothing. Okay, everything else is my perception, right? But I think that we can reach a large consensus on facts, okay? We can probably all agree that the sun is out right now and it's daytime. And maybe, but, so yes, there are facts. And now many things are still open to debate. And a lot of times they're presented as facts and it's not, okay? But it is possible to get to make your mission trying to reach that, as I said, the best obtainable version of the truth, where you try to get to the facts rather than trying to spin some kind of message. And I think that's where the credible function of journalism needs to carry on in some way in the future.
I want to ask Deborah one more question. I want to open it up to you for questions. President Trump, very early in his administration, said he's going to establish policy through his tweets.
And he has.
And he has. Are they public records, first of all? And, for example, in the most recent election that was yesterday, his Twitter feed removed all of the support for the opponent of Judge Moore.
Well, there actually is a lawsuit that has been filed over President Trump's blocking of people from his Twitter. And the question is, because, he had his Twitter before he became president. Is it his personal, or is it now that he is the president of the United States and he's essentially, making or talking about his policy and opinions on his Twitter? Is that something that is something that the public should not be denied access to because it's sort of his official way of communicating with the American public? And I kind of think it is. I don't know how that we could look at his tweets and say that they are not his official way of communicating with the American public. They really are, and they leave, a lot of, what he announces. And in fact, he announces his policies, many of his policies or plans on Twitter. So I do think they are a public record, and I think the question about whether he's denying access to those by blocking Twitter, I think we'll see what happens. It was a First Amendment claim. It was the First Amendment Institute at Columbia, I think, that filed that. So it is kind of an interesting. I wanted to just mention something about social media and the statement I made about the media or the press being a proxy for the citizens. And I think that it largely still does play that role in that many news organizations collect and gather news in a certain way and with a certain vigor, and are not, there are certainly news organizations that are advocacy organizations. But I will tell you, since I started in this job working with the public records law, a lot of the people, our organization is we're an advocacy group. We're an advocacy group for transparency in government. And a lot of the people who call me in my helpline for advice with open records, I get a lot of calls from journalists because they use the open records law a lot, but I get a lot of calls from citizens in nonprofit groups who are advocacy groups in themselves who are trying to get information from government. So I just want to, just so you know that the right to government information is for citizens. It's for everyone. It is not, just for a particular, news media, although news media does use it probably more than anybody, but it is for everyone. And that access to information, should be of concern. And when there is a blocking of that, when either through hook or crook, there is a blocking of access to government documents or government meetings where decisions are being made, everyone should be concerned. I was interested in the story I saw this morning out of Illinois in Aurora, which is about I think a police chief. There was a reporter who asked to see some dash cam video from a camera in which an 18-year-old was shot after a traffic stop, and they were denied access. They wanted to see what exactly happened, and especially in Chicago area where there's so much interest in the police shootings, and there's been so much interest in the video that's been captured on that. And the police chief, they denied access to it. It was a news reporter with the local newspaper who simply asked to see it, had to go to court to try to get it, and eventually was released. But using her free speech, the police chief went and basically excoriated the reporter, and there was a great hostility toward the media for even asking for that, and said, you're asking for way too much information. Sometimes you ask for information, you don't even write about it, you do it for you. And so I think there is some hostility that we're facing in trying to get information like that.
When it comes to a case like that, I was wondering if maybe they would withhold it before the case is, until after the case is over.
Yeah.
Because they're afraid of the media, even just skewing it to a point that they didn't want to interfere with the court
Right.
case.
And they actually have, in Tennessee as well, an exception to the public records law that if it would harm the ongoing investigation, they don't have to release it. I think one of the things, though, that happens in those cases is you see, and this is something we sort of need to understand, we talk about the savvy nature in terms of controlling the message. Sometimes you see, before the investigation is over, a video release, let's say in a police shooting case right away, and gosh darn, the police look like they were certainly in the right, but then in other cases, it's not released right away, and I think we have to think about, well, why is that? And I think it causes some suspicion about, and so, but you're right, there is an exception, and it's a legitimate if they're trying to catch someone. I mean, there are reasons for not sharing everything in an investigative file right away. There are definite law enforcement, government, important reasons to us as citizens that we want police to be able to do their job. So there is something to that, but we need to sort of think it through and not be afraid to question the timing and when they should be releasing it.
Hey, and by the way, Deborah mentioned TCOG representing citizens as well as the media. You all can join TCOG. What is the student rate?
Oh.
$35.
It may be even less.
Okay, I think, look,
Just
I
sign
do know
up for
that
my
that you
email.
can become a member of TCOG for $35. You go to, it's TCOG, tcog.info, okay? So sign up, become a member, help get openness and government here in Tennessee.
Or just follow me on Twitter, and if you are interested in this, we also have a newsletter that you can sign up for, so.
Quick question. I had a quick question. I was just wondering if you've seen much in Tennessee of records being released, but having a ridiculous charge associated with them. I've heard that that's getting to be a common tactic where they'll say, yes, we'll release it, but it's gonna cost $100 a page.
Right, right. No, we have seen that, and that's one way to put up an obstacle of getting information. I know that in Chattanooga, there was a request, do you remember the bus accident where that killed those children in Chattanooga? Is anybody here from Chattanooga? Yeah. And so you might remember that the driver, there had been complaints against the bus driver. So again, if you were a reporter and that just happened in your city, what would be a question that you would think to ask the school district? Anybody?
What were the complaints?
Yeah, what about other complaints? What other complaints have been filed against bus drivers? How many complaints have been filed against bus drivers? So, in fact, the newspaper asked just that. And they got a bill for $2,500 to put that together for you. And they said, well, maybe we don't want 2 years. They had asked for 2 years. Just give us 1 year's worth of complaint. And somehow the bill came back even higher. So, so yeah, it's a problem. And I don't know about you, I bet if anybody here with a news media outlet went to their editor and said, Jack, can I have $2,500? So it's a little bit of an issue, yes. And I think, we had that issue in the Gatlinburg. I was really disappointed. I mean, that talk about East Tennessee and sitting on a lot of information for a lot of time about not the case of the juveniles, but like, how did the city respond? How did, TEMA respond to the fire? There were documents that describe that in detail. And the excuse given by the DA, and he told all these agencies which complied with it, that you can't release it because it will hurt our prosecution of the juveniles. So anyway, that was held on to. But then, finally, when there was some release of information from the Division of Forestry, what was it? Anyway, finally, when one of the state agencies released it, they charged everybody the same amount for this release of documents. And we actually, our local SBJ chapter wrote a letter protesting it. Because it was hopefully information they would have compiled anyway and in the public interest. But so not only had you paid for it once as taxpayers, you still have to pay for it again sometimes. Now you can't inspect for free in Tennessee, so that's a silver lining.
Any other questions? Please, go ahead.
Since you brought up Gatlinburg,
Okay.
I was in Gatlinburg not too long ago, and before the school had started, of course. And I was talking to a lot of the people that live there and work there in some of like the attractions that they have for like tourism and things like that. And they were talking about how much tourism and much economic downfall there's been, not since the actual situation, but the lack of follow-up reporting on the area. So there's actually an issue with the people that went and reported the fire have not followed up on the issue and what the town looks like. So in people's minds that don't live here, they're like, well, it's gone. You know what I mean? Because so where does the credibility fall for like us as reporters to make sure that that need is being met and we're not actually hurting the situation? That's makes sense.
You mean, is there a responsibility to show that it's recovered and trails? Or I had a question from my son who's a UT student, he said, are the trails open? And I said, I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't know. But yeah, you mean in terms of the recovery or there's
Yeah,
something
like
for business?
is there a credibility like to journalism as a whole? If you do a story like that, should there be a follow-up
Yeah.
or is that?
I bet Jack wants to
Yeah,
answer that.
yes, the answer is yes. But it's never so simple. It's the nature of the beast that the media tends to focus on that which is the exception. I mean, you're not going to write any stories about all the planes that successfully took off and landed, but the plane crash gets coverage. And so something of that sort with Gatlinburg. We actually have had a year-long series where we were following 3 families, and once a month, we go back and update their situation. And one is a business owner, another is another type of family. They're representative of the community. And the idea was to kind of track how Gatlinburg recovered. We have a reporter in Gatlinburg today doing some other reporting related to that. But the day that Gatlinburg burned, the day after, on November 29th, the fire swept through on the 28th, it burned through the night. On the 29th, starting at midnight, our website had 63 million page views. And that was, I know that doesn't mean anything to anybody here, but a good month for us would be about 10 million page views. And that was more than the USA Today network nationally had. And so there was tremendous interest in the fire, okay? Can assure you that these stories that we're doing about the follow-up and that they're not getting, let's hope that these stories get 1,000 page views each, because if not, they weren't even really worth doing. And so the media is driven by the public's interest to a large extent, and the public's interest tends to focus on things that are extraordinary and new, and even though a lot may be written about Gatlinburg recovering, it may not get as much attention, and it won't be as much written about it recovering as was written about it burning.
Because of lack of.
Well, because how many stories can you write about that, the Ripley's Museum is open, and it's, you can say it again, but it's still not anything new that sparks any interest. And so there is, you do want to do it, but frankly, it just, people don't even necessarily notice it. But there is a responsibility to follow through and not just leave things and leave them laying. You want to complete the story, and but there is some truth to that. We cover the bad news.
We have time for maybe one more question? No? Okay. Can we thank our panelists?
Good afternoon, folks. I'm Alice Ward, Chair of Diversity and Inclusion League. I want to thank Dr. Martinez and our distinguished panel members to come and speak with you today. As you know, you've been reading through your program. We have a plethora of topics, current issues. I want to highlight just a couple. One, today at 5 o'clock, our Mayor O'Hara, will be speaking in the CCI Patrick Auditorium. Reception prior to that at 4:30, so you're invited. Our culminating activity, yes, we've had 2 to 3 sessions, actually 3 sessions each day, is our Diversity Inclusion Festival. And we want to invite you, that's this Thursday, starting from 5 to 7. Gives you an opportunity to build community. You've sit here as a student, now's your time to mix and mingle with your peers, your professors, as well as the dean and directors. Food, hamburgers, hot dogs, veggie burgers, veggie beans, the works. Your student organizations will be providing different activities. And yes, we've got a bouncy houses and basketball. There's also cultural performances. It is not to be missed. We're not doing this because, yes, we're doing this to build community, and we want to get to know you, and for you to get to know other different people in other majors. So again, I thank you for being attentive. We want you to fill out those forms. Only through your feedback can we bring great, or give you great opportunities. Again, I say thank you very much. Go Vols. Have a great day. How do you guys, I know